Welcome to the Own It Powercast, the place to be when you get serious about making big changes and accelerating growth in your life and in your relationships. Finally create the life you've always wanted, living life on your own terms. Learn how to take your fear and turn it into powerful choices that will create sustained change. Now your host, Mary Baker.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Own It Powercast, the place to come to get what you need to move yourself forward. Hey, it's Mary Baker and welcome to episode 268, Letting Go of Guilt, Embracing Detachment for Your Own Well-Being. Well, welcome to a brand new month and a brand new season where we are going to be continuing our focus on letting go of what we can't control, letting go of what isn't ours to fix, and refocusing on ourselves and taking personal responsibility. To start us off this week, we're going to be getting into detachment. And I know it's something we started focusing on last month as well. But I did that for a reason because we can't know what is ours to own, I don't think, until we disentangle ourselves from other people's stuff. And it's why when I work with relationships, one of the very first things I work with those folks on is healthy separateness, because there can't be trust and growth without boundaries. And I think within that, we need to know all about how unhealthy guilt, which is unearned, can really keep us from setting boundaries, from taking care of ourselves, or just really overall being a healthy partner to other people. So we're going to look at the powerful role that guilt can play in our lives, especially when it comes to detachment and maintaining healthy boundaries. So today we're going to dig deep into the difference between earned and unearned guilt and how to determine what's truly yours to carry and what isn't. And, just as important, how to recognize and respect boundaries between your choices and others. So let's look at how to let go of the unnecessary guilt that keeps us stuck and look at embracing the freedom, I think, that comes with healthy detachment and self-responsibility. And if you need help with any of that, you know I have some courses here for you. I have my main course, Find Your Voice, which is great. It has online learning coupled with a great virtual coaching group and one-on-one support from me. If you just want to figure out what you need, do a power hour with me. The link for that is in the show notes. And you can see what would be best for you. You know, whether you want to do the course, whether you just want some one-on-one help right now, whether you want some of the shorter courses that I have, my 3-part mastermind on how to find your voice, or just the ebook Getting Started with Boundaries. So there are different things for you depending on where you are and what you need. And if you're not sure, always reach out. I'm here to help. Another good way to get a taste of what all this work is about is join us in the private Facebook group for Wednesday evenings Eastern Time, where I do lives on these topics. And what I love about that is it's a conversation. You're not just listening to me, you're asking questions, you're giving your thoughts too, and you're learning from each other, which I love to witness. It's pretty powerful stuff. Okay, so let's get into it. Letting go of guilt. Why does it matter? Well, I think that understanding and managing our guilt is crucial if we want to have healthy boundaries and practice self-care. And I've talked about this before, but I think, again, it's one of those topics that we need to continue talking about, and it might take a while for it to sink in or for us to be ready to really embrace it and work on it. So that's one of the reasons why I bring up topics over and over again on the show, so that you can be reminded. Because maybe you know all this stuff and you've read all the books, but maybe you forgot, right? And just need a loving reminder. So, earned versus unearned. So what is guilt? First, guilt is a feeling of responsibility or remorse that we have for some offense. Real or imagined, and that's key. Hold on to that. Could be real or we could have it in our head. And guilt is a normal human emotion, which is a good thing, right? Because it keeps us from doing bad things to people. It helps us take responsibility for who we are. It helps us to have boundaries. It helps us to try to live out our values, right? So healthy guilt is correlated to behavior change. Usually we want to make it right. We want to clean it up. We want to get it together. But it can become problematic when it is misplaced or excessive. Earned guilt. Earned guilt, I think, is the type of guilt that comes up when we've actually done something wrong or harmful. Like maybe we broke a promise. Maybe we hurt someone's feelings, even without meaning to. Or maybe we violated some moral, ethical standard, whether it's one out there in our culture or one that we hold ourselves or both. So if you blew it and didn't show up to a meeting, that's on you. And if you've done that a couple times, then the guilt is useful because it can help you make amends or change that behavior. If you have some things going on, you haven't worked on your trauma or grief, and you lash out and you're very reactive and you yell at people when you're upset, that's going to have consequences, right? So earned guilt has consequences. I think we kind of know what that is. I think what we struggle more with is the concept of unearned guilt, because it seems like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? But it's really not. Unearned guilt is that guilt that we feel when we haven't actually done anything wrong. And I'm not going to get into a lot of the history behind it because I've done other shows on that. But basically, it comes from external pressures. It comes from manipulative relationships where people used guilt to blur the boundaries with you to get you to do what they wanted. And it also comes from a lot of misunderstandings. And it's the blur of boundaries where we overstep and we start taking responsibility for other people's happiness, solving their problems, or being manipulated into feeling responsible for things outside of our control, right? And just to touch on childhood, the guilt that you would feel because your dad says, look what you've done now, you've ruined dinner, or you've upset your mother, things like that. So, unearned guilt. Because that's essentially saying you upset your mother because you just spoke your feelings at dinner. You didn't throw anything at her. You didn't act out. You were just being yourself. So you can see just right there how unearned guilt can be very problematic. It could have given you really poor messaging early in life. You could be in a relationship now where you're being gaslit every other day into thinking that you should not ask for what you need. Okay? So there's blurred lines of responsibility. And I think understanding and managing our guilt is so important if we want to have healthy boundaries and we want to practice self-care, because guilt, I think, if left unchecked, oh boy, and I'm sure a lot of you can resonate with this, can really lead to you overextending yourself. Because it blurs the lines between your needs, your healthy needs, and the needs of others. And it can make you compromise your own well-being in the process. You overdo it, you help too much, you abandon yourself. And that's why detachment is a part of this conversation. Now, guilt is a powerful emotion that comes up when we feel like we've done something wrong or really let someone down. And it's a useful signal, like I mentioned a moment ago, because it guides us to make those amends and get our shit together and correct our behavior. But what happens is it can also become distorted, especially in relationships, and this is key, where boundaries are unclear, and when we take on responsibility for other people's emotions and their choices. Because when we allow guilt to dictate our actions, we're going to find ourselves constantly trying to fix, trying to please, and or rescue others. Oftentimes, we do this at the expense of our own needs and our own well-being. This is where we start to burn out, we get resentful, we start losing it, and boy, we start persecuting, right? And, like we've talked about here before, there's a gradual loss of personal identity. Like you really lose who you are. It's really important as you listen today to think about the root causes of your guilt when scenarios come up in your mind, because you want to look at whether it's earned due to your own actions or something you were supposed to do and didn't, or is it from something else? I think managing guilt in a healthy way involves recognizing when it's appropriate to take responsibility and when it's necessary to set boundaries instead and prioritize our own well-being, because that's taking responsibility for ourselves. So this clarity is so important because then it allows us to say no when we need to. It allows us to protect our time and energy and practice self-care without that constant fear of letting other people down. And in turn, I mentioned earlier that I think it's so important if we want to have healthy relationships where both of you can thrive, rather than being caught in cycles of this over-responsibility and emotional exhaustion, right? So ultimately, understanding and managing our guilt, I think it helps us live more authentically. I think it helps us to respect our own limits and foster relationships that are built on mutual respect and healthy detachment instead of obligation or fear. So when you work on this, it's really helpful to ask yourself questions because you're trying to clarify your responsibility. And guys, this is why it's really hard to do this work alone. I know I keep saying that, but it is so true. You need to run it by other healthy humans so that they can mirror back. No, that wasn't your fault, or that's hers, that's not yours. Because you need to hear objective reality. And you cannot depend on your own head giving you that if you've been in relationships for most of your life with blurred boundaries. That's going to be really, really hard. Even if you had relationships in the past 10 years where people weren't screaming at you and trying to make you feel guilty, you were blurring those boundaries by yourself. You were assuming a lot. I mean, there's just so many ways you could talk about this. So you need some objectivity there. So one of the first questions we have to ask ourselves is, did I actually do something wrong or harmful? And how do I know? And according to whom? And according to what? Is it illegal? Is it against my values? And if not, then it's probably unearned. Like you have to prove that you did something wrong or harmful. Now again, even with the unintended net effects, there's earned guilt there. Maybe we didn't think about how canceling at the last minute would make our friend feel kind of thing. I mean, that's earned guilt, right? Another question to ask yourself is, am I taking responsibility for someone else's feelings or choices? I'm doing a Facebook Live on that this Wednesday on that, so tune into that if you want to talk about this more. And then finally, is this guilt coming from my own values or from external pressures? And those external pressures, what I mean by that is, who is trying to put this on you? How healthy are they? What is their agenda? How might they, in other words, benefit from you feeling guilty and feeling like crap for saying no to them? Again, this is why we can't do this work alone, because there's a lot of variables to sort through here. It can give you a headache after a while. We can't rely on ourselves to have the perfect perspective. We're not going to see pieces that other people can see. Now, within that, we still have to do a lot of work on our self-awareness. So this is really important when we're working on recognizing when guilt is earned and when it isn't. Because without self-awareness, we can really easily become overwhelmed by feelings of guilt. And so it's going to be really hard to distinguish between what we're genuinely responsible for and what isn't ours to carry. And remember, that lack of clarity is what's going to lead to those unhealthy patterns where we overextend ourselves, we take on more than we should, we sacrifice our own well-being, because we're trying to meet the perceived needs of others. Keyword perceived. So that self-awareness is where you want to begin if you haven't done this work yet. And it can seem a little overwhelming, and it's okay. All I want you to do first is just start noticing. And you're not allowed to beat yourself up either for feeling guilty. Don't pile on, please. You want to try to take a step back and just keep checking in with yourself throughout the day. You want to look at the source of your feelings. You want to ask yourself things like, why do I feel guilty right now? Like, what's that about? Did I actually do something wrong? And how do I know? Or am I taking on responsibility for their stuff? Is this guilt coming from my own values? Or is it someone else's expectations or my perception that they have expectations? See, because, and gosh, I'm not going to get into this too much because that would make us rabbit trail. But a big part of this, you're probably not asking questions either. Of course not. You're assuming, oh, she needs me, or he'll get upset, or I have to, or I'd be a terrible daughter or son if I didn't do that. We're not negotiating. We're not asking explicitly because that's way too vulnerable. And again, if your boundaries are already blurred with other people, you don't feel safe. You actually don't feel the need to do that either. I'm being snarky, but that's true. So when you're doing this internal work and processing with healthy people, you're making it a habit to reflect on these questions. And you start learning how to separate out the earned guilt from the unearned guilt. And then you look at some of the unrealistic standards maybe you've internalized. So it really helps you get better at making better decisions down the road. I mean, there's a lot of great things that come from this. But the first thing we have to do is create healthy separateness. So if we want to figure out what the boundaries are, if we want to work on the boundaries with this, we've got to look at not misplacing our guilt because we don't want that to dictate our actions. I want you to think for a moment right now, times in your life where you've done things out of obligation or guilt that you could kick yourself for because it wasn't in your best interest. It was because you were trying to people please or avoid conflict or all the things. And again, don't be hard on yourself. I want you to bring a lot of compassion to that because if you did that, that means you've been hurting and it's not your fault. But as you work on this, you're going to become more empowered and you're going to have more clarity and more compassion. So in order to work on this, we have to, what I call, talk about the boundaries between choices. So we need to identify who owns what. What are your choices versus their choices? And I like that key word choices because when we hear ourselves say, she had a choice, he had a choice and he chose poorly, or he decided not to do the right thing, I think it helps us to feel less bad for that person. We can have compassion and sadness for them, but they're not a victim as much as they want to play that they are, as much as we want to pretend that they are too. Because see, if they're a victim and they're helpless and it wasn't their fault, we would be a horrible human if we didn't jump in and rescue. But if we lovingly detach without judgment, we say, those are their choices. And just like we have our own choices that we've made that weren't so fabulous because maybe we didn't take our time or we didn't take the mature route or whatever, they do too, and they need to learn from their own stuff. And so the first order of business is doing the who owns what. What are your choices separate from theirs? So your choices are the actions you can control in any given situation, like your reactions, your decisions, how you behave. So unlike the actions or emotions of other people, which are not in your control, your choices are within your direct influence, and they can have a lot of power. Especially over time, you're going to notice that your experiences and your outcomes are influenced by your choices. You get to choose for you, in other words. So let's get into that a little bit because I think this is important. So the first one, your reaction. So those are your nanosecond immediate responses to anything, right? And they're usually emotionally driven, a lot of times by fear. So while our initial response might be automatic, how we choose to react on the outside is within our control. So let's say we're being faced with some criticism or conflict. We can choose to get really defensive and shitty, or we can practice being calmer and being more open to constructive criticism, to hearing what the other person needs. So really practicing awareness around this helps us use the different part of our brain, like we've been talking about here. And so we can choose responses that maybe align with like long-term goals, like I don't want to push this person away kind of long-term goal. I don't want them to think they can't bring stuff to me. So again, back to your values and how you want to see yourself. Decisions. Your decisions are deliberate choices you make about your actions, your attitudes. So they can range from tiny choices you make throughout your day to really big ones. And when you listen to this, think about the other people in your life are doing the same thing. That's what helps you to detach, right? So maybe like deciding how you spend your time, who you spend your time with, what kind of things do you get into. You have the power to decide how much energy you want to invest in your relationships. You get to decide when you set boundaries and how to set boundaries and how to prioritize your self-care. So all these decisions and a million more. In essence, you are taking responsibility for your happiness, your growth, and your well-being. Tied to this are your behaviors. Those are those actions you take based on your reactions and your decisions. It's how you communicate. It's how you handle conflict. It's how you go after your goals. It is how you practice self-care. Now, you can't control the behavior of others, but you can always control your own actions and how you show up in different situations. Like maybe you might choose to practice patience. Maybe you work on assertiveness, or maybe you work on empathy in your interactions. So when you start focusing on what you can do, rather than trying to control insidiously the behavior of others, you're going to have healthier dynamics. I promise you. So understanding what truly belongs to you can feel overwhelming at first and kind of scary because you don't want to F it up, and I get it. What I want you to know is if you're ready to start this process, you're going to be fine. It will unfold for you. The things you're supposed to work on today will show up. But it's a really big deal because it lets you take ownership of your life. It helps you focus on your own self-improvement and work on healthy detachment, rather than getting all entangled, all caught up, and trying to change others to fix them, fix their feelings, make them happy. Instead, you're going to put your energy towards making conscious, constructive choices. You're going to feel healthier, more balanced, and more confident, and a lot less anxious. Okay, so those are your choices. What about their choices? Understanding that other people's choices are their own actions and decisions is a big deal. It is fundamental if you're going to have any kind of healthy boundaries in your relationships. Because each of us has autonomy over our own life. And here's the part we don't want to hear, and we need to remember, is just as we want to have the right to make our own decisions, they have the right to make their own decisions too, and they have a right to follow their own path. And here's the hard part, especially if it's someone you love, and especially even more so if it's your kid. They have the right to experience the consequences of their choices. And we can't prevent that. And we don't want to, guys, because we want them to learn the lesson this week, not 6 years from now. If we recognize this, it can really help us realize that we're not responsible for managing or controlling the behaviors of other people, no matter how much we care about them. And again, that's why you hear me talk about the three-legged stool all the time, because the other leg, there's detachment, there's boundaries, and there's grief. You're going to do some grief work once you start letting go. And it's not going to be fun, but it's going to be healthy. Here's the thing, just as your choices reflect your values and your needs and your beliefs, so do theirs. You know, each of us operates from our own set of values, our own needs, our own experiences, our own level of healthiness. So what might seem like a poor decision to us, and this is key, could be a choice that aligns perfectly with their values, or more accurately, probably what they believe is best for them at the time. Right? So, for example, what if a friend of yours chooses to stay in a relationship that you see as unhealthy? Now, while you might be really tempted to intervene and persuade them to do otherwise, it's really important to let it go and to remember it's their decision to make. And it's based on their unique perspective and experiences. And that's where it's hardest for us to separate. Our thinking, our perceptions, what we think is right or the best thing to do. We really, if we got honest, want everyone else to believe like we do. But we really need to respect autonomy and personal responsibility. They are responsible for their own actions and decisions. And we're respecting their right to navigate their lives as they see fit, just as we want people to do for us. But remember, this means allowing them to face both the positive, because there's good stuff, and negative consequences of their choices. You know what happens when we intervene too much, when we're trying to steer their decisions, you know it's going to blow up and be counterproductive. Again, you're preventing them from learning essential life lessons. I want you to think for a moment, what are some lessons that you have learned, and on this side of it, you're grateful that maybe you had to bump up against something and learn the lesson and how it changed your life for the better. If you want them to grow and take responsibility is the other piece, you got to stop owning it or they won't. A real smart-ass thing to ask yourself or ask someone else is, so this means you're going to carry responsibility for that forever? Because they're not. They're not going to worry about paying their bills because you're going to pay them. Is that what you want? Now, most of us would say, oh, hell no, I want them to own up. I want them to make it all better. Well, if you do, you got to take your hands off of it. Now, of course, it's natural. We want to protect. We want to help those we care about. And this gets really hard when their choices seem really risky or potentially harmful. But here's the thing. We can't and we shouldn't control the decisions of others. If we're trying to control or heavily influence their choices, you know we're just creating resentment. Both ways, guys. They're not going to like you very much, and you're not going to like them very much either. It creates dependency, and the big kicker, a lack of trust in the relationship. And I don't think people talk about that aspect of it or not. Like if you have to rescue someone, there's no way you can trust them to take care of themselves. You're not going to do that. And they feel that too, and then you're just perpetuating, I could go on, the perception that they can't handle it. So healthy detachment, like we've been talking about, means recognizing that boundary between where your influence ends and where someone else's responsibility begins. It means caring deeply for other people while trying to, and this is the process, trying to accept their choices are not yours to make. But at least you're honoring their journey and you're giving them space to learn and grow on their own terms, and they're going to own it and they're going to allow it to shape their future. They're going to have a healthier relationship with you. They're going to feel better about themselves eventually. And we want them to grow and we want them to be accountable. We want each of you to be accountable to yourselves. And when we detach, we allow them to experience the natural consequences of their actions, which, Parenting 101, let the kid have natural consequences. Let the kid leave the bike in the driveway and let it get squished. They're not going to do it again. When we detach, it allows them, and I watch this happen when I do relationship work, it allows them to reflect on their own decisions. It allows them to learn from their own mistakes like we do ours and develop problem-solving skills. People, and I work with these people. Growing up, parents did everything for them. Not only did they met a message that, you can't do that, we need to tie your shoes for you, but they also just didn't have the on-the-job training experience, right? We need that. We need that experiential data to learn and grow. So I want to get into some examples of what this looks like, because I think it's one of those things where I think it's a lot easier when we're talking about situations. So typical scenarios, the first one's overwhelmed parent. So let's say a parent notices that their teenager is really struggling in school and not doing well. So then, of course, the parent starts feeling guilty and believes that they should do everything possible to make sure their kid gets better grades, even considering completing some of the homework, nagging and reminding to study and to hand their stuff in. So who owns what here? Well, the parent's choices, what they actually can control, is providing a supportive environment, offering to help with study habits if needed, and setting those boundaries like limiting screen time or this is homework time, and then you walk away. What are the teen's choices that the parent has no control over? Well, how the teenager chooses to manage their time. Are they putting effort into study? What is their attitude towards their schoolwork? What's their emotional life around it? So the parent should focus on what they can control without taking over that teenager's responsibility for their own education. And you can't anyway, guys, you can't. Another good example is if you're worried about your friend's unhealthy lifestyle choices, like maybe drinking too much or not eating well, you're going to feel guilty for not doing more to help, and you contemplate constantly checking in or trying to control their decisions. And probably imposing your own beliefs about health, right? Well, expressing a concern in a compassionate way is fine. You can give them information, you can talk about your own journey, and you can be a supportive listener. But what you can't control is whether they decide whether or not to change their lifestyle. Whether they want to seek help, whether they care about their health, like all the things. Here's another one that I run into a lot. Let's say a sibling feels guilty because their brother or sister is making really poor financial decisions, and they're constantly borrowing and they have ongoing financial instability, like it's a thing. So, of course, the supportive sibling is bailing them out all the time, giving them money or wanting to take over their finances to prevent, future mistakes. Who owns what here? The supportive sibling needs to set boundaries, and they need to set boundaries around lending money. They need to stop offering financial advice or resources and stop nagging and stating their concern. Maybe they're not ready. Maybe they're not ready to be grown up around money. Maybe they're not ready to do any of it. So those are some examples that are typical to give you a sense of how common this stuff is and how sometimes we may not see it because it's in our day-to-day interactions, but it is really important. Those are the moments that matter. And they're about setting emotional boundaries, I think. So one of the things you can start doing with yourself on the inside, or maybe journaling, is using some affirmations like, I am responsible for my choices and others are responsible for theirs. You can say, it's not my caca. That's about them. That's not about me. Those are their choices. And then really just reminding yourself, and you may not believe it at first, and that's okay. It may seem selfish or uncaring to say those things in your head, but that's okay. Just keep doing it. And then thinking about the emotional piece, maybe journaling about that or sharing with a safe person, like, what are the fears coming up? What are you trying to control? What are you trying to make happen or unhappen? And that'll give you a good sense of the vulnerable stuff that's driving this. So yeah, guilt can be a great teacher if it is earned and if it's about our stuff. But it can also be misplaced and it can create stagnation, because if you feel too guilty, you're not going to ask for what you need. You're going to rescue and resent that person. And you're not going to allow other people to learn their own lessons, and you're not going to learn yours. Okay, we want to do empowerment, not enablement here. We don't want to enable dependent behaviors. And also, we don't want them to feel guilty either for making us upset about their problems. Do you see how messed up that is when you say it out loud? So this is something that is worth working on no matter where you are in the process. It's good to return to and reevaluate where you are in your relationships. And if you struggle with some of this stuff and you need some help, please reach out. Cannot do this work alone. So create awareness. Decide who owns what. Is it earned or unearned? And how do you detach from their choices and focus on your own? So today we looked at that complex emotion of guilt and how it can really get in the way of our ability to maintain healthy boundaries. It can make it really hard to practice self-care, and it can hurt our relationships. We talked about earned versus unearned guilt and how to look at what is actually within our control and what isn't. And then finally we got into, what does it look like to detach from someone else's choices and refocus instead on ourselves and starting to take more responsibility for our own. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you got some good stuff that you can take with you this week to work on. Again, reach out. All the links are in the show notes for the courses, or if you want to work one-on-one with me. Appointments are going fast, so if you really want to do that, please sign up soon and take good care of yourself this week. All right, so pay it forward, keep focusing on you, and I'll see you next time.
We hope you took away some useful insights and tools you can begin using right away. If you did, please leave a positive review and share on your social media. Because could you imagine if everyone in your life really got it together? Remember, own it now, so you can really own it later.